Thank you all. So I'll just sort of jump in. Most of you probably know a lot of the incarceration history at Poston and all of the, many of the other camps. So in this presentation, I'm really focusing on the connections with the Colorado River Indian tribes where Poston sits on their land, and just sort of a broader overview of the connection between the communities, specifically in the context of Poston. So the reservation for the Colorado River Indian tribes stretches along the Colorado River on both the Arizona and California side. It includes almost 300,000 acres of land, with the river serving as the focal point and lifeblood of the area. The primary community on the reservation is Parker, Arizona, which is located on a combination of tribal land, leased land that is owned by the tribe, and land owned by non-Native Americans. There are other smaller communities on the reservation, including Poston, which is located about 10 miles south of Parker. And Parker is up here in the north part of the reservation, and Poston is sort of partway down south along the river. So the Colorado River Indian tribes include 4 distinct tribes, the Mojave, Chemehuevi, Hopi, and Navajo. The Mojave and Chemehuevi are traditionally from this area along the Colorado River, and the Hopi and Navajo come from other parts of Arizona and in the southwest. The Crit Reservation was created in 1865 by the federal government for Indians of the Colorado River and its tributaries. And like I said, the Mojave and Chemehuevi have had inhabited the area for centuries. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Hopi specifically being relocated from other parts of the state to the reservation in later years. So in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act established a credit fund that allowed tribes to develop their natural resources. During World War II, the Office of Indian Affairs, today known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the War Relocation Authority sort of jumped on this ability to expand the reservation. They specifically wanted to focus on expanding the irrigation system, and they used the wartime incarceration as a way to establish the expanding of the irrigation system and agricultural sort of infrastructure in the area that was named Poston, where the incarceration camp was located. Poston was named after Arizona's first superintendent of Indian Affairs, Charles DeBrill Poston, pictured up here. He, in 1864, before the reservation was formed, he asserted the rapid influx of population in this region renders it necessary that some provisions should be made for the original inhabitants. He envisioned the Parker Valley, which he saw as underdeveloped, and he wanted to develop the agricultural infrastructure, specifically the irrigation. And so Poston was recommended as a spot for the location of the incarceration camp to basically use cheap Japanese and Japanese American labor to develop the agricultural infrastructure during the war. So in 1942, when deciding where to locate the incarceration camp, they basically chose it as a spot for that. John Collier, pictured on the lower half, was kind of an instrumental person in that process. I'm sure you've all heard more about John Collier. I'm not going to go into great detail about him today. So during this time, in April of 1942, Collier wrote to the Crit Council chairman, Henry Welsh, basically proposing the use of reservation land for the incarceration site. And basically the tribal leaders were upset and adamantly opposed to the location of this incarceration camp on their land. But sort of the precarity of this position, they ended up, instead of directly objecting to the proposal, they decided not to respond to it. But what happened, of course, the Office of Indian Affairs and the War Relocation Authority went ahead anyway and decided to plan the incarceration camp. The Office of Indian Affairs justified the appropriation of congressional funds by promising that the project would actually benefit the tribes, and not just the Mojave and Chemehuevi that were already living there, but also other tribes. And like I mentioned, we'll talk about the Hopi and Navajo that came later. You'll see now a map of the post and incarceration sites. And you'll see here, it's sort of in the middle of the sort of reservation area. As most of you know, Poston had 3 separate campsite locations, Poston 1, 2, and 3. And a lot of the work that was done through the incarceration camp was to develop the agricultural infrastructure, which is still in use today by the current sort of on the current landscape. And like I mentioned before, the Office of Indian Affairs basically were able to hire for pretty cheap Japanese American incarcerees to work on to develop this irrigation system and the agricultural infrastructure. Poston held a unique position within this system because it was not just managed under the War Relocation Authority. It was also managed under contract, managed by the Office of Indian Affairs under contract to the War Relocation Authority from its opening in 1942 until the end of 1943. And as one tribal member reflected about this sort of incarceration site is that the Japanese American incarcerees lived on a reservation within a reservation. So I had mentioned earlier about the Hopi that came to live on the reservation once it became incorporated into the tribes that currently make up the Crit. And so the Indian Service began pressuring the Crit tribes to open their reservation to others. The Tribal Council had resisted until 1945 when they were basically threatened with the loss of a substantial portion of the reservation to non-Native families. And so the Tribal Council passed Ordinance Number 5, which reserved a portion of the reservation for colonization by other Native groups. And the word colonization is the word that has been used by the sort of tribal infrastructure and the Office of Indian Affairs. Not necessarily a word I would choose to use, but that's the one that gets used. We can probably have a discussion about that later. But the ordinance basically divided the reservation into 2 portions, the northern and the southern reserves. And the Hopi and Navajo tribes, as well as other tribes living along the Colorado River tributaries, were recruited to develop the southern reserve. So in 1945, September 1st, 1945, the first of 17 Hopi family colonists moved onto the Poston Camp 2 compound. There were still Japanese American families living at Poston at the time, so they were kind of neighbors. And many families lived within the barracks for several years until the development of the Southern Reserve was completed. Now moving sort of in the more recent time, since the 1980s, many Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at Poston have visited the site and have formed friendships with Crit members and undertaken several programs and projects together. As you'll see here, photos of the Poston Memorial Monument, which was conceived of in 1989 through dialogue with the Crit tribe, was established and erected in 1992, and the kiosk that also stands there today was put up in 1995. And on the kiosk, there's sort of a detailed history of both the post and internment camps and some of the tribal history as well. And so this sort of marks the beginning of a really fruitful relationship between the Japanese American community and the tribal community in terms of like preservation. In 2003, a strategic visioning session was held over 3 days with members of the Japanese American and Native American communities, resulting in the creation of the Poston Community Alliance. And their mission and vision to preserve the multi sort of cultural history of Poston, both the tribal and Japanese American histories. And some of the folks who have been instrumental with this relationship have been the former tribal chair, Dennis Patch, who you see here, the current tribal chair, Amelia Flores, and the current vice chair, Dwight Lomayevsva. And Dwight was one of the children in the photo earlier of the Hopi families. He lived in the barracks at Poston Camp 2. And then another very important person that we've been working with is the Crit Museum Director, Valerie Welsh-Tabo. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. It's still morning. My name is Koji Lau-Ozawa. I'm an incoming professor in anthropology at UCLA. First, I want to thank Chizu, of course, for bringing us all here together for this wonderful 2-day conference, and to Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages for helping to put this all together, and my 2 other panel members, Katie and Hana, for joining me today as we talk about this topic of Japanese American incarceration and its intersections with Indigenous land. So I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, so I'll just get started and we'll see. There we go. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the WRA and the Office of Indian Affairs, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The archaeology of Japanese American incarceration. I'm an archaeologist, and so I approach this subject through a lot of archaeological methodologies, my work at the Gila River incarceration camp, and a little bit of work I'm doing at the Old Loop Boarding School and Citizen Isolation Center. So the WRA and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there's a long, I think, lot of overlap, both structurally and in personnel and conceptually, between the War Relocation Authority and the Office of Indian Affairs. This is a memo from the WRA as they start to name the camps, talking about Hunt in Idaho, Minidoka, and Gila River, and really thinking about naming camps for people in quote-unquote Western history. And I like to start with this just to talk about the way the camps were conceptualized in part by the federal government as part of this larger trajectory of settlement, of land development, and how they viewed the land in this lens of settler colonialism and this lens of almost sort of terra nullius, empty space that the government could fill with its policies and its structures. There are a lot of personnel overlaps between the Office of Indian Affairs and the WRA, people like John Collier, who Katie talked about, Dylan Meyer, who was in the Soil Conservation Service and would eventually become the director of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, people like E.R. Fryer or Wade Head, who went between the BIA and the WRA. And so you have a lot of people at various levels of these organizations moving back and forth between the Office of Indian Affairs into the War Relocation Authority during the wartime, and then they move back into the Office of Indian Affairs. So there's a really entwined legacies to how there's organizations within the government are structurally set up. Gila River was one of the first reservations to be established in Arizona in 1859. It's a reservation of Alkamil Otham and Peeposh peoples. It's oriented around the river, the Gila River, and the Otham people have a long history of agriculture along this river, which really gets stifled in the 1880s as Western settlers come across the United States. They divert water upstream of the reservation, and they really dry off the reservation. Between the 1880s and the 1920s, there occurs what are known as the 40 years of drought and famine on the Gila River Reservation, where water gets cut off, there's not enough to irrigate the fields, there's famine, and so there's a really fraught relationship between the tribe and the US government over water rights, which continues through the incarceration and into the post-war years. Gila River, this is the proposed area of the Gila River incarceration camp that the WRA was interested in. That green section to the right, which you can sort of see over here, this is Butte Camp. Gila River is divided into two camps, Butte and Canal. And this green section was cultivated land, about 6,000 acres of alfalfa that was cultivated between the late 20s and 30s as water got brought back onto the reservation with the San Carlos irrigation project. And really is what attracted the War Relocation Authority to selecting the reservation in the first place to place an incarceration camp. They saw this land, which was partially cultivated by children from the Sacaton Indian School and other youth on the reservation. And they looked at this agricultural project as potential for the incarceration camp to do agriculture at Gila River. All of the camps were supposed to be in some ways self-supporting. Gila River becomes one of the most agriculturally productive camps, but really it's built on this foundation of indigenous labor that predates the construction of the camp itself and first draws the eyes of the War Relocation Authority to the site. And I think it's a really important part of the story. So I do archaeology, and so as Jeff and Mary talked about yesterday, I want to also give credit to them for doing a lot of the foundational work on the archaeology of Japanese American incarceration. There are all these sites. There are many archaeological projects going on at various incarceration camps over the last year. Jeff and Mary's work really set the foundation for much of this work over the years. And a lot of it is predicated on looking at the material remains. We think about archival evidence, we think about oral historical evidence, but also what's on the ground and how do we understand that and how does that bring a different lens to interpreting the story of Japanese American incarceration. A lot of the establishment, this is a Google Ngram chart that shows sort of the frequency of different names for Manzanar, Gila River, Minidoka, and Jerome. And you could see when Manzanar gets declared a National Historic Site, it really spikes up in interest. A lot of things get written about Manzanar. Similarly, when Minidoka becomes a National Historic Site, the creation of these park sites and the archaeological work that's going on in these locations, these place-based histories, really drive up a lot of interest. In 2016, you see another spike that I attribute to my starting of the PhD program. I'll take credit for that. Actually, it's in 2016, the presidential election, I think, really brings the frame of incarceration back to contemporary relevance. And you see, again, a real increased trajectory of people thinking about the incarceration camps. What meaning do they have today? And then how we interact with the camps, I think, is a really important part of our responsibility. Gila River is where my family was incarcerated. It was, I think, the third largest camp by population after Tule Lake and Poston. Two camps, Butte and Canal Camp, held about 16,000 people over the 4 years. The peak population was 13,300. I start with community-based archaeology, thinking about what communities are connected to these sites and how do you work with them in a non-extractive manner. Also thinking about what does it mean to be working in native and indigenous space? What does it mean to decolonize? How is that performed not just metaphorically or allegorically, but really bringing collaborative research design to these projects, working with tribal members from the get-go, from the formation of questions to the methodologies, and the actual execution and then dissemination of research. This involves a lot of different things like trust, collaboration, listening, being able to change and respond to feedback, dissemination, thinking about not just writing archaeological reports or journal articles that only other academics will read, but multimodal ways of presentation, and then participating in communities and making sure that you're not just there to parachute in, extract data, and then come out, but really participate meaningfully with the communities that you're working with. The Gila River Indian community is often called just an Indian community, like one community, but it's actually comprised of many different organizations, many different government structures, non-governmental organizations, and different members. And so it's a really actually complicated community, and I think that's something that's also really important to hold in mind. I'm going to zoom through the rest of this. I put like 45 slides up here, and I have about a minute and 40 seconds left. So we do a lot of different kinds of methods in archaeology, survey, using drones, different kinds of mapping techniques, non-destructive methodologies. This is where people from Gila River were taken from before being incarcerated in California. And then I'll just zoom through some of the different kinds of results. There's a lot of archaeology out at Gila River, different kinds of ponds and garden structures that people built. This is just an illustration of some of the kinds of mapping we can do to recreate the different blocks and understand how gardens actually interfaced with the barracks and where people lived. Also doing what we call catch and release methodologies with tribal members, which is taking artifacts from the place, examining it on the site, and then putting it back so nothing gets taken off of the camp itself. And you can find a lot of different information about pre-war and incarceration activities, what kinds of things were flowing into Gila River, what kind of access did people have to different goods that differed from pre-war communities like Santa Barbara, which sent most of its population to Gila River, and at the camp itself. And then I'm working right now with some colleagues on a fragment of a surabachi that was found at Gila River, and we're doing starch analysis to see what kinds of things were actually used in it. We're finding things like corn and different tubers. We're trying to identify the different species and get actual insight to what's being used in these kinds of ceramic materials. Finally, for the last 30 seconds, I'm working with several colleagues, Davina Two-Bears at Arizona State University and June Sinceri at UC Berkeley at an Old Loop archaeological project. Old Loop was a federal Indian boarding school on Navajo Nation that operated from 1909 to 1942 and was closed in 1942 ostensibly for flooding, but in part to be opened up in 1943 as a citizen isolation center after the Moab Citizen Isolation Center was closed. It held over 70 Japanese American men, citizens, with over 150 guards. It had a 2-to-1 guard to prisoner ratio. And we've been starting field work this last year to do, again, collaborative community-based archaeology at the site, non-destructive, non-extractive, everything we find we're leaving at the site, but to really understand the overlaps of these histories. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it in the panel discussion and the Q&A, but we're going out in a couple of months. I'll have some flyers on July 19th for Community Day. You're all welcome if you'd like to come out to Arizona and brave the 105-degree weather and north of Flagstaff. But thank you very much, and I'll leave it there for now.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hana Maruyama. I am a Yonsei on my dad's side. I'm descended from Heart Mountain, Gila River, and Jerome. And I am coming to you today. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut. That's my day job. So we've already talked a little bit about the Arizona sites. I want to turn now to the Bureau of Reclamation sites. Last summer, I visited Minidoka for the first time, and the closer I got to the site, it was the weirdest thing, the lusher and greener the land got. 10 miles out, it's arid, dusty, windswept plains, not unlike what the incarcerees would have encountered, but the site itself now is covered in alfalfa and soybeans and other crops. It reminded me of my first trip out to Heart Mountain, age 12, sitting in the back seat. My parents are bickering because they can't find the way out to the cutoff to the site. And I'm sitting there being like, we've got to be getting further away from it because it's getting really green. And that is not what my grandma and these books that I've read have told me about. So Minidoka, Heart Mountain, and Tule Lake. Those are the three sites that the WRA leased from the Bureau of Reclamation. And they look the way they do today, in no small part due to Japanese American incarceration, but also This is a symptom of US settler colonialism. So who's heard of US settler colonialism? Can I get a show of hands? That's great, I love that. So settler colonialism, just to give a little recap, is frequently attributed to Patrick Wolfe, an Australian settler scholar who identified it as distinctive due to the prevalence of settlers who come to stay. And in doing so, they replace the native population. Unlike forms of colonialism that center on resource extraction and labor exploitation, ruled by a fairly small minority of colonizers. While Wolfe vocalized settler colonialism to the academy, it's important to note that he was not actually the first to theorize this concept. Indigenous people have been theorizing this within their own communities and nations for over multiple centuries. Wolfe, however, showed that settler colonialism relies on tactics of elimination of the native, which includes genocide, but it also includes things like the spread of disease, forced assimilation through residential and boarding schools, the separation of families through the foster care system, the criminalization of native religions, cultures, and languages, the elimination of ecologies necessary to maintain traditional native lifeways, and many other forms. Is the mic working? Okay, good. It sounded a little weird after. Settler colonialism has, of course, failed to eliminate Native Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Alaska Natives. It also is worth noting that the struggles they faced are not a thing of the past. We see this with the Dakota Access Pipeline, the challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act in the Supreme Court, and the disproportionate numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous people being just a few examples of how this continues into the present. So as you'll have seen from Koji and Katie's talk, settler colonialism played a pretty obvious role at Gila River and Poston. But you have to dig a little deeper if you want to see that at Heart Mountain or the other Bureau of Reclamation sites. Heart Mountain is on land that many Plains Indian nations, including the Apsaalake or Crow, the Eastern Shoshone, and the Lakota, traverse seasonally. And for the Apsaalake, at least, Heart Mountain was a major landmark and sacred site. Tule Lake, meanwhile, is on land that historically belonged to the Modoc and was a major site in the US Modoc War, while Minidoka was on land that historically belonged to the Northern Shoshone and Northern Paiute. The US progressively dispossessed these nations of their homelands by confining them on reservations starting in the 1850s. For the sake of time, I'm going to mostly focus on Heart Mountain. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 cut off Crow access at the Wyoming-Montana border, but Apsaalake hunting and fishing rights in Wyoming were supposed to be protected even after that, into today. In practice, Wyoming fisheries and wildlife continues to criminalize them for practicing these rights, despite the fact that the Crow won a Supreme Court case protecting these rights back in 2019. While a treaty might sound pretty final, this dispossession was actually fairly piecemeal, and there were Apsaalake who were living in the area around Heart Mountain into the 1890s. The US really tamped down on Apsaalake movement through the region with the arrival of the railroad to Billings in Montana in 1881. This triggered an influx of settlers into the region and led the Bureau of Indian Affairs to work with the Army to punitively confine Apsaalake to the reservation. The US has a long history of facilitating white homestead access, particularly for veterans. This goes back to the Revolutionary War, but as settlers took over all of the arable land to the east, they progressively started to look for ways to to populate the arid and desert regions of the South and West. And I say populate, but really I mean settle, because there were obviously already people there. First, they do this with the Carey Act in 1894, which is named for a Wyoming senator and was supposed to promote private irrigation. In practice, it really showed the futility of trying to use private irrigation to fund projects on this scale. We see this in the example of a man named William Cody, or more popularly Buffalo Bill Cody, who, along with some friends and business partners, invested in a speculative venture to irrigate the region. It became very quickly a money pit. What I want to show is that the federal government protected white settlement pretty consistently in this region. This is a core facet of settler colonialism, coming to replace. Cody's investors started to sue, and eventually the state of Wyoming intervened and requested that the new Bureau of Reclamation, which had been formed in 1902, take on the land to irrigate the region. Cody didn't exactly make his money back with the government intervention, but he also didn't lose any more money on the project. It cut off the lawsuits that he was facing, and it satisfied the disgruntled homesteaders. Cody also still owned multiple businesses and large tracts of land in the region, so he stood to gain in that way. As Buffalo Bill quickly learned, the environment was a huge obstacle to Reclamation's visions. The project went through 3 contractors within 3 years as it attempted to build its dams. The Shoshone Dam project also flooded the nearby town of Marquette, necessitating that the government offer damages to the dozen or so settlers that lived there for their farms, which, remember, weren't really irrigated at that time, so had limited agricultural value. Farmers received up to $18,000 in one case, and the government spent a total of $400,000 to settle all of them. Reclamation gave away homesteading plots in these lotteries that brought would-be homesteaders in from across the country. But even if the land was free, homesteading was not cheap. They essentially would not make any profit for the first couple of years while they cleared the land, and it took a couple of harvests to develop the nutrients in the soil. And the problems were really just beginning. The dam that they built caused the reservoir to fill up with silt. Strong Wyoming winds then blew that silt all over the crops, burying them in these mountains of dust and dirt for multiple years in a row. Reclamation paid settlements to homesteaders nearly every year for 10 years, and the problem persisted until 1991. Some of these problems were due to Reclamation's tampering with the natural environment. Others were just the result of cold Wyoming winters. In winter 1915, ice jams caused damage for farmers along the river, and the government offered 26 farmers more than $8,000 in settlements. Still more problems were caused by the settlers themselves. 95% of Reclamation's homesteaders, the ones who had been deemed to have the experience necessary to qualify for these lotteries, had never farmed this sort of arid land, and almost immediately began over-irrigating it despite Reclamation's warnings. Nearly 2/3 of the irrigated acreage in the area was damaged within 2 years. Alkali in the roots would not only kill the crops, but also hurt the land for seasons to come. But farmers refused to heed Reclamation staff. Instead, the agency spent more money on a costly drainage system to mitigate the harm the farmers were doing than on the dam itself. Clearly, Reclamation was very invested in protecting white property. We can also see this instinct to protect it in the site selection requirements the WRA used. The War Department had 2 requirements. The sites had to be far removed from any military installations, and they had to be able to confine a minimum of 5,000 people to use the military police as efficiently as possible. From there, the WRA had a lot of leeway. The agency established its own set of criteria. These criteria changed over time. In spring and summer 1942, the WRA and War Department reviewed over 300 sites. 100 sites underwent field investigations by soil scientists, engineers, and other agricultural experts. So they were evaluating these sites for their capacity to create opportunities for labor, incarcerated, racialized labor to irrigate and create agriculture. The staff meeting notes for April 29th, 1942 describe a talk by Robert Cousins, who led the WRA's operations department, in which he delineated these site selection requirements. The site had to hold 5,000 people, preferably 10, had to have agricultural work, a water supply, had to be close to the railroad, needed to be on the public domain, and there needed to be, quote, little displacement of white settlers. This requirement is not listed in most of the list of site requirements, but it's worth paying attention to because April 29th, 1942 is right when they're deciding what sites they're going to choose. Think a little bit about why they might not have included that in writing. So by late May, the first Japanese Americans are arriving at Tule Lake. August, the first Japanese Americans are arriving at Heart Mountain in Minidoka. They are soon put to work, they finish irrigation projects, they develop a bunch of land. All the while, Reclamation is very insistent that Japanese Americans have to be removed after the war. This tells us a bit about how they view Japanese Americans fitting into US settler colonialism. By 1946, Japanese Americans were removed from Minidoka and Heart Mountain. Reclamation was hosting new homesteading lotteries that year. By 1947, Tule Lake is closed and homesteading lotteries are happening there. The land that had been developed by incarcerees was some of the first to be selected because the farming they had done essentially meant that those farmers could skip those first couple of years where they were not making any profit and they could immediately start harvesting and making a profit off of it. But this is not a settler colonial success story. In 2011, Grant Bulltail, an Apsalike elder, began organizing Return to Four Tops Father ceremonies. Four Tops Father is the Crow name for Heart Mountain. These bring back Apsalake to celebrate the mountain and learn about their ancestral relationships with it. Bulltail passed away from COVID in 2021, but these ceremonies do continue on. Today, Johnny Yellowtail, who is also Apsalake, works as a custodian for the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, where he gives tours to visitors and talks about Apsalake relationships with the mountain, as well as Japanese American experiences in its shadow. At the same time, Apsalake's ability to enact their relationships with the mountain depends largely on the goodwill of the Nature Conservancy, which owns it today. So it's important for us as we advocate for these incarceration sites to think about how we can foster Native access to their land and to be cognizant of how our actions impact Native sovereignty and nationhood and their ability to advocate for themselves and their lands. Thank you so much.
I'll get started. I think one thing that I thought was really, really interesting hearing both Katie, Hannah, your papers or your talks today was the way in which also at Gila River, there is this sort of racialized labor that happens at these sites. And then sort of the aftermath and legacies is something I'd like to know a little bit more about. I know at Gila River, one of the things I found very striking is narratives of Japanese American agricultural labor at the site often eclipse indigenous agriculture at Gila River and feeds into, I think as Karen Leong has argued, the erasure of indigenous labor and the sort of perpetuation of a myth of indigenous poor land use. And so that's been a real legacy that I think our community needs to discuss and talk about in the post-war memory of the camp. But I'm interested at these other sites, how the sort of post-war legacies of labor and their intersection with indigenous history are framed.
Yeah, at Heart Mountain, there's this like very lovely sort of story by Eiichiro Sakaue, who started the Heart Mountain Agriculture Program, and he describes going back to Koji and being like a white woman comes up to him in Koji and comes up and shakes his hand and says, "You guys started this agriculture in this region. We didn't know what this land could do until you came here." And so it's a sweet story. I have complicated feelings about it too. And I worry about what's happening at Colorado River right now. It's in a state, I think many of us are who are based in California know this. It's in a state of crisis, and they're really turning to the Colorado River Indian community as kind of the leaders in this situation. I also think it's worth noting that Gila River Indian community, the Akimel Atam, had a really long tradition of farming that went way before settlers. They had a huge irrigation system, actually, that was like very expansive. I think it crossed a lot of Arizona, actually.
Into northern Mexico as well, thousands of years.
Yeah, so the idea that they weren't farming is complete BS.
Yeah, at Poston, sort of the story is kind of similar in terms of the idea that the agricultural infrastructure that's in use today on the reservation is they're very like grateful for the sort of thankless work that the Japanese Americans did to create the current infrastructure. But yeah, there's a long history of agriculture there, and some of it was some of the knowledge about how to work that land was lost during colonization. And so one of the things that some of the tribal members talk about now is being able to sort of be like thankful for the work that the Japanese Americans did to help them reclaim some of those. It's different, of course, different ways of working the land, but this ability to work their land again.
Hi, my name is Scott Tsuchitani. I'm an artist and cultural studies scholar. During my graduate research, I had the privilege for a brief period working with Isao Fujimoto, who's a scholar activist who helped develop the community development program there. So I got to learn about his kind of concepts around community-based research, but not enough to get a practical sense of how to do it in that horizontal relationship, non-extractive relationship. So I want to thank all of you for your exciting and super relevant research, but I want to ask Koji about practical experience with that and how do you manage to equalize that unequal power relationship?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a really important and complex question when thinking about what the power relationships are between researchers and writers and the communities they work with. So working at Gila River, we've really been thinking about how to work with my colleagues at the Gila River Indian community as partners. And that starts with the co-creation of questions. So often research will start with a research question. So talking to my colleagues about what parts of the history they're interested in, and this is also what we're doing at Old Loop, talking to both descendant communities from folks who were incarcerated at Loop, but also folks who are at the boarding school and Dene community members locally. What do you want to know about this history, and what tools, if we as researchers have equipment and tools and methodologies, what methodologies are of interest that can also answer your questions? And so if we start by co-developing those research questions, and then from there, developing methodologies together, I think that starts to put it at a more equal relationship from the get-go, rather than being like, I have questions, I want to go in, can I have permission to do that? Which is, I think, often how research is carried out. So it's a long process, and I think that's a thing that is really important, is there's a lot of lip service often to community-based research, but it's a long process. It takes a lot of time and dialogue and ability to take course correction, to listen, to get feedback, to try something after discussions, and then to receive criticism and change direction as well. And that's a long process. At Loop, we started conversations with Dene community members in 2019, and then the pandemic happened, and then we phoned in to chapter meetings on conference calls through 2021 and 2022, and my colleague Davina Two Bears, her family's from Bird Springs, which is very close to Loop, and she did a lot of groundwork in person, and then we went out in person last year, but 2019 to 2024 is 5 years of dialogue before we do field work. And so it takes a lot of investment, takes a lot of time, but I think that's worth it, and that makes the talk, works to try to equalize those power relations, even if it's imperfect, really working towards that partnership rather than extraction.
And I just want to say thank you, Koji, for that, because for, I don't know if there's younger people out there, I don't have my glasses on, but as you're doing research, you just need to do the right thing, and that's the right thing to do when you're working with community. But Alice has a question.
Hi, thank you for this amazing panel. It was really wonderful, and as a historian, I'm always excited to learn from archaeologists and anthropologists. But related to the question about cooperation and support with other communities, and especially here, Indigenous communities. So I love your comment about co-creation, because I was talking to Nancy Ukai about how that is also what we are trying to do when we do oral history as well, so that it's not extractive or just one way. But one of the questions I had was, especially for Koji, because you had in your slides all these amazing tools, including drone technology. And I wonder if all three of you could talk about the kind of technologies that you're using in your field now to help us recover and preserve this history.
So thank you for that question. I think the tools also really help thinking about what kind of non-destructive methodologies we can bring. Archaeology classically has been excavation, which is a very destructive process. You can't reverse excavate once it's taken out of the ground. And so in the work that I do, we use high precision mapping material. We use UAVs or drones to get aerial imagery, high resolution photogrammetry where you can make 3D models of the surface. Similar with technologies like LiDAR. Also have used portable X-ray fluorescence, which is a non-destructive, essentially sending X-rays at an object and getting the bounce back to get a material trace. and then residue analysis, where you wash sort of the surface and then look for phytoliths, with their small, essentially stones and leaves that you can use to identify the kinds of materials and starches that were on the surfaces to see what was actually in ceramics. And I think those technologies really help to expand the way you can do different kinds of analysis without destroying things, without taking them or removing them off-site permanently, which really opens up a lot of doors.
Yeah, thanks, Koji. I'm traditionally trained as an archaeologist, even though my current research is much more, it sort of sits in the space of critical heritage studies. So my current research uses a lot of oral history interviews. But another aspect of this sort of work is looking at doing analysis on collections that have been previously collected, that have been sitting in boxes in museums or other spaces where they've been held for many, many years with nobody looking at them. So that's another sort of avenue for doing this kind of work of looking at these older collections, still using some of the more traditional archaeological sort of material culture analysis, looking at, you know, some of the things that Koji shared with like different types of ceramics or other artifacts. But that's like a big problem in archaeology, is collecting and having these large collections that never get looked at. And so a big aspect of working with communities is also being able to actually go in and look at those collections and figure out what to do with them with the community's involvement, because they might not have been originally like extracted with the consent of communities. And so being able to say, hey, we did some not so great things by collecting these artifacts without your permission, but what can we do now that will be honoring of what your interests are right now? So that's another big aspect of that.
I was trained in American Studies at the University of Minnesota, and what they say about American Studies is that they are methodologically promiscuous. So yeah, I was not good at committing to a certain, type of text. I use a lot of historical archives, settler archives, and critique those archives quite a bit. University of Minnesota also has a really good Native American and Indigenous Studies program, or American Indian Studies program as it's called there. And so part of it is also learning how to read those archives in a way that is actually attentive to Native American and Indigenous studies. I also use a lot of material culture. I did an internship with the Hohokam Heritage Center when I was in grad school. I go on a lot of pilgrimages. I do cleanups. I do oral histories. I analyze other people's oral histories. So yeah, it's kind of all over the place. But I actually think that's kind of what this work needs. Part of what I talk about in my book project, which is still in process, is that there's a reason you don't really hear the Colorado River Indian community and the Gila River Indian community and the mixed Alaska Native and the mixed American Indian incarcerees' voices in the archive, and that is actually a symptom of settler colonialism and its intent to eliminate the Native, right? So what I want to show is that if you bring these sources together, they can really critique the archive, the settler archive, and show its limitations to us.
And I actually just wanted to ask a follow-up question on what Alice was asking, but also what you've just talked about with oral histories. Just if you have a brief moment, is there a specific oral history that stood out to you, either with Indigenous peoples or with former incarcerees, that have been really integral to your research, either in archaeology, in helping with a specific project, or just in part of your general research? And I've been thinking about with the old Loop boarding school, because I've been looking at narratives. So there was the brother of the author Gino Oishi, who was taken from Gila River and sent to Old Loop. So just some thoughts I was just thinking about. So yeah, thanks.
Well, right now I'm in the process of my PhD, where I'm actively working through the oral histories that I did collect for that process. So I don't have a good answer for you right now with my own research. It's sort of for those of you who aren't familiar with doing oral history research, you often do many interviews and then go back later and have to listen through them, create transcripts, and like it's a very lengthy process to really make sense of. And so I'm smack dab in the middle of that. So I don't have any really like nuggets of great information right now. It's all sort of a jumble for me, but I'm excited to be able to work through that as I move forward with my own research. But I'll hand it off to you guys.
I'd say there's no sort of one oral history that peaks out in my mind. I think some of the things I've really found the most intriguing and thought-provoking in oral history work are just some of the small moments of levity and things that somebody will say that they don't think is really that important. But it's, of course, the thing that I'm like, oh my God, that's the most important. And it's always right at the end of the history as they're walking out the door. By the way, when I was doing field work at Gila River, for instance, these two women community members came up on our work site, and they were asking what we were doing, and they were chatting, and they said that, they sort of remembered their relatives talking about the camp being on the reservation, but that they grew up in the 70s, and they used to go to the campsite, and they'd sort of think about these stories. But one of the things they would do there at Gila was where the mess hall platforms were, the mess hall foundations were on these large concrete slabs. Everything else was lifted up on barrack footings. And they'd go to the mess hall slabs to roller skate, because it was like the best way to roller skate not in the roads on the reservation. And they were like, it was like a really fun spot, and it was the only place we could roller skate. And it was a really, I think, intriguing way to think about the afterlife and legacy of these materials that were there on site. And, they are sites of trauma, they are sites of violence and history, but there are creative ways that I think community members there are interacting and reappropriating these materials to create new things like temporary roller rinks in the 70s, which I think are really beautiful, actually, ways to interact with this material culture and this site that was an infringement on the tribe's rights, that was put there against the community's wishes, and that has exposed so many people to these histories of violence.
They all come to mind. So I also, when I was in grad school, I created with my little brother a podcast called Kampu. And if you know anything about Kampu, if you've listened to it, it includes a lot of oral histories. And my brother, the poor audio engineer among us, had to go and make all of those oral histories work together. And we used like 80 plus in some of the episodes, which was no small task for him. And he eventually was like, Hannah, you gotta cut it down. You can't keep doing this many oral histories. It just takes forever to edit them. So I feel like what Koji was saying about like the asides, the laughs, sometimes what I've noticed in oral histories, and I think my grandmother used to do this too, and my grandfather, sometimes Nisei will start laughing and you want to cry. Do you know that? And to me, those moments are such a like Nisei communication style. And it's something that I've talked about with my students quite a bit, because they don't understand that. They don't hear the laugh and think, oh, that was really hard. They think, oh, it wasn't that bad. And so to get them to understand that sometimes when someone is laughing, it's a way of processing trauma is, I think, something that has really stood out to me from Kampu. The other example that comes to mind is Harry Ueno, because you were talking about Loop. He has so many good oral histories, and I was actually just writing, we co-authored this chapter with Davina Two Bears, who has also worked with Koji, on Loop. It's in a new anthology from University of Washington Press. And what he talks about in his oral history is that he was imprisoned in a basement room for 2 weeks and isolated from the other incarcerees. And he hypothesized that this must have been where Dene Navajo children were imprisoned in the boarding school, because Loop used to be a boarding school. And if you look in the archives, there's very little record of those kind of carceral
spaces that we know were in boarding schools, right? It's part of the living memory of boarding schools, but it's not written about in archives. And I just found that moment to be very powerful, that he was down there and he understood that this must have been happening to these kids before him.
Yeah, so let's thank our panelists, Katie, Koji, and Hannah, for a wonderful panel.